Daniel Fink to come and discuss the effects of singing on laryngopharyngeal reflux.
Good morning. My name is Daniel Fink, and today I'll be presenting our research, the effect of singing on laryngopharyngeal reflux. Before I get started, I'd just like to take a quick second to thank the Academy for this opportunity to present. I'm not going to go through everything that my colleagues have already gone through this morning, but laryngopharyngeal reflux may be broadly defined as the retrograde flow of gastric contents into the laryngopharynx where it comes into contact with the upper aerodigestive tract. And as per everything else we've heard this morning, it can succinctly be said that it is a controversial and high prevalence disease. The Restech DX pH probe, as been discussed previously, is measuring aerosolized as well as humidified refluxate. It is, generally speaking, more comfortable for patients than the standard dual pH probe. It's easily placed in the office without the need of manometry, and has been shown to have a significant correlation with the dual pH probe, which in a study by Golub et al. Was shown to be especially strong when participants were upright. So the question we started with is, do singers reflux? With the common thought being that reflux laryngitis is especially common among trained speakers and singers because of high intra-abdominal pressure associated with proper support and because of lifestyle. Some newer and interesting physiologic data has shown that there is a significant increase in upper esophageal sphincter pressures during phonation, and also that exposure of the distal esophagus to acid causes a consequent increase in upper pressures. There is some subjective evidence
that there is increased reflux in singers. One survey by Camerata et al. Among Italian opera choristers did show increased rates of heartburn, regurgitation, cough, and hoarse voice as compared with controls. If you prefer Hungarians, then there is a study by Probem et al. Which showed that Hungarian choristers had increased rates of heartburn and regurgitation as compared to controls. Again, all subjective data. Extremely limited objective evidence for reflux in singers. A study out of University of Miami by Lundy et al. Used stroboscopy to evaluate 65 healthy voice students and found that 3/4 of them developed posterior erythema. Further subjective data, half of them had worse voice in the morning, and a third had frequent throat clearing. So we further refined our study question to ask if there was a correlation between singing and actual decreased laryngeal pH during the time of singing, that the physical act actually caused a so-called stress reflux, which is well defined in the paper by Camerata et al. So as we conceptualized our study, we decided to monitor professional singers for 24 hours using the DXPH probe. 1 hour of this was spent singing without standardized repertoire, and they were not observed during this time of singing. They did it on their own. And for our exclusion criteria, we excluded any participant who was on proton pump inhibitor therapy who was not willing to go on a 2-week washout period. And we excluded anybody who had a previous Nissen fundoplication. Conceptually, we did not exclude participants for a history of laryngopharyngeal reflux or GERD, but fair disclosure, we had no participants who had a known history of laryngopharyngeal reflux or GERD. So our two outcome measures were that we compared mean pH and the number of acid events, which we defined as pH drops below 5.5 per hour, between 3 separate time groups: the time spent singing, the 23 hours of control time, and the 23 hours of control time with the time spent supine factored out. And we based that pH level of 5.5 on the Restech recommendations, as well as by a good study by Ayazi et al., which is where Restech got their data from. Our study population, unfortunately, was a little bit limited. We only had 8 participants, all of whom were trained singers, either trained in conservatory or currently being trained in conservatory at time of study. Reflux finding scores ranged from 2 to 20 with a mean of 10, and reflux symptom indexes ranged from 0 to 25 with a mean of 10 as well. Our results, which we were a little surprised by, was that the mean pH actually increased in singing as compared both to the control time as well as the control time with the time supine factored out. When we looked at pH events instead, we found that there were more acid events in the singing group as compared with the control time minus supine as well, but less than the control time, during which the time supine actually has a lot of acid events. In terms of analyzing these numbers, we used a paired two-tailed t-test to compare the mean number of acid events, and found no significant difference when comparing the singing group with the control minus supine group. In comparing mean pH, We used a one-tailed t-test starting with a null hypothesis that singing would decrease pharyngeal pH. And we were able to reject that null hypothesis when comparing singing with control time with statistical significance despite our small study group. However, when we factored out the time supine, our results approached but did not reach statistical significance. So the current theory of stress reflux, that contractions in the diaphragm will increase acid reflux, wasn't borne out by our study. There may be some role of the upper esophageal sphincter, as discussed. This is sort of just starting to be studied, but there does seem to be an increased contraction at the UES during phonation, which may protect the pharynx and larynx. And in the backdrop of this, we have to imagine that proton pump inhibitor therapy may not be as benign as we always thought it was. There's a great review by Chapman et al. That discusses the risks associated with long-term proton pump inhibitor therapy, including pneumonia, C. diff, diarrhea, and vitamin deficiencies. So in conclusion, in our study, singing did not cause more pH drops or a decreased mean pH. However, given what we had to work with, we would recommend further study to better define the relationship between singing and reflux. Our study certainly had its limitations. We had a small sample size, which was limited by trying to recruit healthy singers to wear a pH probe for 24 hours. Our singers were not observed during singing, and they did have a varied repertoire. We had no singers with frank laryngopharyngeal reflux, which in some ways would have been a much more interesting study. And we did not have any measurement of non-acid reflux events, which is another thing that's just sort of starting to be defined. Thank you very much for your time.